Putin thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. As you know, Mr. President, I said to you in the beginning, he's counting on us not sticking together. He was counting on the inability to keep NATO united. He was counting on us not to be able to bring in others on the side of Ukraine. He thought he could outlast us. I don't think he's thinking that right now. God knows what he's thinking, but I don't think he's thinking that.
President Biden promising American solidarity with Ukraine in its war against Russia. Now we're learning details about that historic visit to Kyiv and how it was kept under close guard for months at the White House. Joining us now, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer. John, thanks for being here this morning. Boy, we've started in the last 24 hours or so to get some of these details about how this came to be, what you all were working on for weeks and months, as it turns out. A flight on a plane that was not the usual Air Force One, quietly leaving Andrews Air Force Base, a 10-hour train ride, a motorcade without sirens. To the extent you can, tell us about how this came together.
Sure, thanks. As you and my former colleague Jen Psaki know well, there is always an incredible amount of work that goes into any presidential trip. That said, this one had a significantly higher degree of difficulty, in part because it had to be kept secret, so it was done by a much smaller group of people, and in part because usually you don't have to worry all that much about the physical security of the boss, of the president. But in this case, traveling into an active war zone where the U.S. does not control the ground, where the U.S. does not control the sky, where he was going to be going in over land, a very long journey over land each way, there were just elements of this that were unprecedented, required even more meticulous planning than these trips normally undergo. And, you know, we were quite relieved and quite gratified by how well things went on the ground. We knew, I think, that it would send a strong message once the president arrived, and that took care of itself. But we were also quite pleased that there were no hiccups that can happen when you're traveling in a place that is an active war zone.
John, we know that President Biden has wanted to make this trip for a while. What made it okay now as opposed to?
Look, we did a very long, extensive security assessment. The intelligence community was involved, the Secret Service was involved, the Pentagon was involved, and at the end of the day, the trip was planned. The president was briefed on all the details over a period of weeks, and then on the Friday before he actually departed, he sat with his cabinet, some members in the Oval Office, some members by phone. He got everybody's advice and decided ultimately to go ahead with the trip.
John, congratulations on organizing this. We're left with the basic question that President Zelensky and President Biden both put, which is, when will this war end? President Zelensky said 2023 is the year of victory. President Biden said, as long as it takes, we're with you. Give us your assessment, the White House's assessment of what's going to happen this year in this battle. Is there a Ukrainian counteroffensive coming? What do you expect?
So I think predictions in these situations is a bit of a fool's errand, so I'm not going to project too much. But what I can say is we are doing what we've been doing throughout this conflict. President Biden announced another $500 million in security assistance while he was in Kyiv. That wasn't the main news of the trip, but it is important to continue to demonstrate that we are going to provide assistance going forward. The Ukrainians have said they fully intend to go on offense in this conflict during the spring and the summer. We are getting them the resources we think they need to be able to do that effectively. But I'm not going to put a time limit on either our support or on the conflict. This is a very hard and difficult war. There will be more difficult days ahead. Yesterday, we think, was a very good day. There will be other days that are not so good, and we're going to be with with the Ukrainians throughout. I don't usually quote someone like Senator McConnell in these situations, but I heard a quote that was played on this broadcast just a minute ago from him that said, we're not going to put a time limit on how much we will continue to support Ukraine. I think that's exactly our mindset as well.
So as you and I both know, the next day you wake up after a big trip, and then there's still big questions about what's next and what are you giving us? And the big question is, what about these F-16s that the Ukrainians want, that people have been talking about? Why is that not something the United States wants to give at this point or provide? And what are the other types of military support that Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and others will be discussing in the weeks ahead?
So we are discussing and will continue to discuss everything we think the Ukrainians may actually need on the battlefield in the immediate term. Our approach has been the same throughout. At each phase, we have tried to provide them what we think they need to be successful during that particular phase of the conflict. And frankly, it has been successful. That was Stingers and anti-tank weapons in the first phase, when it looked like the Russians may actually move on Kyiv, the capital. The Ukrainians succeeded in repelling that with in huge part thanks to the weapons that we provided them. That the war evolved into more of an artillery war. We've been providing them significant numbers, hundreds of thousands of rounds of artillery for that phase of the conflict. Now it is armored vehicles, tanks, armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles to allow them to go on this offensive that we know that they intend to conduct in the spring and the summer, and we will continue to assess and provide them what they need when there is the next phase.
Jonathan Lemire.
Hey, John, wanted to get you to respond to what we just heard from Russia's President Vladimir Putin a short time ago. He delivered a speech there to a number of the elites in Moscow. More of the same, doubling down on his claims as to why Russia's involved in this fight. But in particular, I want to get you, he made some news here and says that Russia is going to be suspending its participation in the New START nuclear weapons treaty. Tell us what the administration's response is to that from Putin.
So, look, Russia has not actually been in strict compliance with New START for quite some time. We think their announcement that what sounded like a suspension as opposed to a full withdrawal is frankly unfortunate and pretty irresponsible, but really the latest in a series of steps that shows that Russia is not taking its international obligations seriously, not taking international law seriously. This administration actually extended New START, one of the very first things that we did upon taking office after it had been negotiated for quite some time, but hadn't been completed by our predecessors. And we're going to be continuing to assess not just what the Russians say on this topic, but what they actually do. And for now, that's where we are.
Any reaction to news that China's going to be putting out their own peace plan in a few days? Is that positive?
Well, I think it really depends on what the plan actually says. So we'll look to hear the details. It's one thing to say that you are for peace, another thing to describe exactly how you're going to get from here to there in a conflict in which neither side appears exactly ready to get to the negotiating table. But what I will say about the Chinese is if they are actually interested in bringing about an end to the war, they should talk not just to the Russians, but actually to the Ukrainians. And if they are going to develop a plan, it should be done in consultation with Kyiv, not just with Moscow. They seem to want to have it both ways. They are providing a lot of support, increasing support that we've said we're concerned about to the Russian government while saying they're for the end of the war. I'd be interested in hearing more about how they plan to get there.
And what are the consequences if China ramps up military support for Russia?
I don't think we're going to flag in advance what we might do in this or that situation. We have said quite clearly that we think providing additional military support to Russia in this moment would not be constructive, would not be conducive to bring about the end of the conflict that they say they want. But for now, we're just going to keep watching this and see what they actually do.
All right. Thanks so much, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer. Quite a day yesterday. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.